because of course the plants don't have a nervous system, don't have brains, they're not neural systems, and yet they are able to do and perform the same tasks. So the question would be like, then obviously this structure, the brain and the nervous system, for how amazing they are and how useful they are in those systems that they have them, they're not the end of the story.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So in today's episode, we have the groundbreaking topics in plant cognition studies of plant intelligence, plant behavior, plant memory, and plant communication to get our teeth into. Now, the type of experiments we'll present here today have never really been done before, because there's always been an assumption in plant science that the cellular cognition that all living cells have relies solely on light, touch, or chemical interactions. So it doesn't really permit for plant behavior, plant memory, or plant consciousness. So with my guest today, the first scientist to bypass these assumptions and try these tests, we're going to discuss her experiments with plants that clearly show not only basic memory and the corresponding updated behavior based on that memory, but even Pavlovian memory. So associative memory that requires arbitrary stimuli to take on a special meaning to the plant. Now, obviously, all of this has a massive implication for distributed memory and for the existence of memory beyond brains and neurons. We're also going to be getting into plant medicine and other indigenous approaches to connecting with plants, and what plant communication and biophilia in general might do for our relationship to the natural world as we face imminent biosphere collapse across the planet. Now, my guest is, of course, the Research Associate Professor of Evolutionary Ecology at several universities in Australia, Monica Gagliano. She's published over 60 scientific papers across the fields of ecology, plant cognition, plant communications, and marine ecology. And she's also the author of the books The Language of Plants, Science, Philosophy, and Literature, and the highly celebrated Thus Spoke the Plant, a remarkable journey of groundbreaking scientific discoveries and personal encounters. Now, I can't believe how time has flown, but we have come to the end of the fourth series of Chasing Consciousness. A massive thanks to all of you for your support on the podcast so far. Please keep subscribing, reviewing, rating, commenting, and sharing the shows with your friends. It makes a massive difference to getting this podcast out in front of new like minds. Now, I have wanted to speak with Monica about this ever since we started exploring animal and plant cognition here on the show. So I simply can't wait to get into this. So without further ado, let's go. Monica Gagliano, welcome to Chasing Consciousness. Thanks for coming on the show. How are you today?
Thank you, Freddie. I'm good. Getting ready to go home to Australia.
Okay. So you're in Italy. I'm finally in the same country as one of my guests.
I know. The best time to get our times aligned, I guess.
Brilliant. So, Monica, I often start asking my guests about the first really deep questions that they pondered on when they were still kids. So just after they became aware of their own thoughts, usually sometimes sort of 6, 7, 8, 9, it can vary. What questions can you remember jumping out of your memory as somehow relevant when you look back now?
There were many. I think I was the horror for my parents. But I think there was definitely one question that I just couldn't get my head around, and I guess still I can't. It was this idea that there was, the chicken and the egg. And it's like, no, wait, it doesn't make sense. You can't have one and then the other, or have one and not the other. And I couldn't work out. So where does life come from, really? Like, how did it start? So that was the big thing. And I guess I still don't know the answer.
Well, that's the crazy, isn't it? I mean, there you are, a child dwelling on this. And in fact, it's one of the biggest open questions in science today. So interesting.
That's right.
Monica, before we get on to the data from your groundbreaking experiments about plant memory and behavior that are just such an important and challenging jump forward for plant studies, I want to set the context for the listeners because we might not know much about plant cognition by explaining the sort of general consensus in the field about plant cognition. So, how plants are understood to sense changes in the environment via light, via touch, via chemical interactions, and how they have been understood until now to signal to each other. And maybe you can start with that, Monica, just sort of steel manning the field's general view of plant cognition so far. Steel manning in the sense of sort of describing it the way a scientist working in that old paradigm might describe it.
Okay, so I guess I should describe what it was when I landed into it, because officially I'm not a plant biologist or a plant physiologist. I was trained as a marine scientist, and I was actually an animal ecologist working with fish primarily. And so when I landed in the plant space, I was coming in with questions which were the question that we would ask about animals in terms of behavior and communication. And so if you think of an animal, most questions will be involving, how do they smell things? How do they see things? How do they know stuff? And so when I came into the plants, I was like, I wonder if we, do we have the same questions in the plant space, and what are the answers to those questions? And it was interesting to me because I was expecting nothing there. And instead, there was quite a bit already there, especially on the chemical communication, which by the time I entered that field, it had a good 20 years of work done, on the volatiles of chemicals, which are basically the chemicals that we can smell when we touch plants. If you think about a basil plant or even a tomato plant, when you brush the leaves or the pines, all of those smells are caused by volatiles that plants use for themselves, of course, to either attract someone that they want, like a potential pollinators, or of course to deter and trying to push away anybody that wants to eat their leaves. And so there was that kind of science was getting well developed, and by the time I arrived in the space, it was kind of accepted and became already, I would say, mainstream mostly. And so the idea of plant using chemicals to tell things to each other, so communicate, was already starting to take roots, I guess. The other thing that was really also well known was the use of colors, of course. I mean, we just need to think of flowers and the stories between flowers and the pollinators, which is huge. But also colors in terms of actual light, and how plants can see changes in the frequencies of light, and use the specific frequencies to determine what's going on around them. For example, and at that point, these studies were already well done, well established. For example, we know now that plants can evaluate the changes in the ratio. This is quite crazy, but it's actually true. Changes in the ratios between the red and the infrared. So they're not evaluating the single frequency of light, but the changes between the relationship between the two. And based on how this shifted, they would know whether there is a plant next to them that is growing too fast, and so the risk of being overshadowed and therefore having to change your own growth rates to compensate, or whether maybe it's not growing at all because it's a fence. And if you are, for example, a climber, then you can use that structure to climb over it and grow towards it. So all of this work was already done, and I thought it was beautiful. Coming again from an animal perspective, it's like, oh wow, this is like just like animals. I guess it was framed not so much within a cognitive term. It was more like, oh, this is just what plants react to when they are exposed to these things. And there is a difference between reacting to a thing and responding to a thing. So reacting is just like, oh, it's all encoded in your way of being plant or being animals. And so you don't have any control on what you do. And responding instead implies that you're actually evaluating, and there is a degree of control of what you are going to do next, which is what we recognize in animal. But at that stage, it was at least not openly recognized for plants.
And it's opening up the agency question there as well, which is right
Exactly.
at the center of all cognition, isn't it?
Exactly.
So one of your important findings is still being incorporated into that consensus, that of bioacoustics. So the proof that plants emit sounds to communicate, and their
Precisely.
ability to receive information through those sounds of other plants. So just to be clear, listeners, this is separate from the sounds generated by humans based on the changes in the electromagnetic fields of the plant. There's a lot has been done with that. It's very cool. But we're not talking about that here. We're talking about actual acoustic sounds being emanated and even received. Can you tell us about your by now famous finding? Because it just really serves as the perfect opening of perspective to sort of enlarge the scope of how we might see plant cognition.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for the clarification, because I receive a lot of emails from artists and also the general public that mention these gadgets, which are now we can buy online anywhere, that do exactly what you said. You know, they just record the electromagnetic or the electrical signature of a plant, but it could be also your own electrical signature, and then they translate it into a sound that is pleasing to us, and therefore it looks like the plant or you, if I plug you, make this music. This is not what we are talking about. So what we're talking about is what one would be talking about if instead of the plant you would have an animal. And in fact, the entire idea comes precisely from there, because in the animal behavioral space, of course, sound, if you think of birds, if you think of many of the mammals, marine mammals, many of the terrestrial mammals, everyone is talking all the time. And they're doing that primarily through sounds. And so the question was like, it's interesting. Like in the animal space, everyone is using sound to communicate, amongst other things, of course. And why is there nothing about plants? Or what was there was the secret life of plants, which exactly was the more of a deterrent for any serious scientist to go and look into the question than nothing else. And in fact, when I started posing the question, some of my colleagues were like, "Oh, is that like the secret life of plants?" I know. I want to really know whether there is something to do with sound, like the acoustic energy of sound and plant life. And there was also another element. I was also interested in, I was reading all sorts of things about not just ecological, biological sciences, but also like from anthropology and other social sciences. And there were stories about humans being able to listen to the sound of plants, but from a very different perspective. And that story was kind of intriguing for me. So it kind of like was a mix of like, okay, so there are stories about human being able to detect these sounds that apparently are emitted by plants. And then there is the story from the more Western perspective, which is, the secret life of plants. And I was wondering whether there was something in the middle that was more like, okay, this is Western science. And so I started thinking about the question. And in fact, I wrote a review about if this was possible, then what kind of question would we ask to even explore the question itself? And of course, I used many of the animal studies that I knew of to show that plants could also potentially do this or do that. And for example, using the echolocation of bats or dolphins as an example of like, well, plants could also use a sort of if they were making sound, they could use sounds as an echolocation device, because you can be stable and fixed like a plant is, and you can send your signal out and just wait for it to come back to you depending on where it's bouncing off to, and that will provide you with information about the environment, which really is what the plants already do with light. So it would have been, so I had this review where I was making these examples of things that, we can look at the systems in animal and maybe ask those questions in the context of plants. But of course, the crucial thing was, but do plants actually have sound to play with? And clearly, it's easier to think of plants receiving sound from their environment, because of course, whether they can hear it or not, they're certainly immersed in sound all the time, like we all are. The harder part was like, okay, so you might be receiving sound, but can you emit it yourself? And does it have any meaning to you, whatever you're emitting or whatever you're listening to? And so then I collaborated with colleagues in Bristol University, and they really are expert in these spaces of bioacoustics, especially, obviously with animals and insects. And so they had all of the equipment to measure very fine scales these vibrations, because basically sound is a mechanical wave. So you measure it as you measure other type of vibrations. And so we went in the dungeon because you need to be in a space that is very soundproof. It doesn't tremble when a truck comes by on the road next door to you. And we started playing and trying to see whether it was possible to detect anything being emitted and detected by the plant. And at one point, there was a little test, which is what you would do if that was an animal. And you do what we call like a bioassay. So you present, it's very simple, really. You present one specific frequency at a time. And you are assuming that if a frequency elicits a response, the other, in this case, the plant, would do something in response to that. And of course, our first problem was talking about plant behavior, which was already like at the time a word that, yeah, exactly, you couldn't really say too much or not too out loud. But and of course, it's like, okay, so you're looking for a response. What kind of response can a plant give you? What is it that we are gonna see? And in our case, we were lucky because when we started doing these assays and playing back basically individual single frequencies like 100 hertz signal and then 200 hertz signal one at a time, then we saw a very clear pattern where the plant is not, in this case we're talking about little roots of baby corn seedlings, and what you saw is like that the roots will grow vertically, perfectly straight, actually really nicely with gravity, until we hit certain frequencies, and then the roots bend towards the sound. And then when we pass that range of frequencies, in this case was around the 200, 300 hertz, the plants again keep growing vertically with gravity. So it was like, okay, so we have a behavior that we can observe, this bending of the root, and it's not random because it's happening only when you have those specific frequency being presented. And then, of course, we had no idea what those frequencies meant for the plant. But it was a beginning to show that, okay, so they can definitely perceive and they are selective in their perceiving. Of course, you can't tell whether those frequencies where the plant is officially not doing anything, just growing with gravity, is the plant able to detect those frequencies but choosing not to do anything about it because it's like, yeah, I can hear it, but I don't care, or it really can't hear them. So those questions remain open. But the important thing about this work was that, okay, they are selective, they can respond, and we can see these responses as a behavioral response. Then, of course, from there, we looked at what would happen if you do the other way around. So in this case, we gave the plants a specific frequency and looked for a change in behavior. And so we used the amazing instruments, highly sophisticated, in the lab in Bristol. And we use laser technology to basically shine a laser onto the root and see what would come back. That's why the echolocation idea as well, it seems appropriate, because basically that's what we did to see whether the plant was itself vibrating and therefore sending a message or a frequency back. So this technology that the colleagues in Bristol were using on insects, I think originally was developed by engineers to measure vibration in relation to earthquakes. And so the idea was very simple. If you have a laser and you shine it onto a wall, and if the wall is completely still and is not being moved by anything, the laser will return to the source pretty much a bit distorted because it has traveled, but it's a distortion that is expected, but pretty much in the same way as it went out. But if the laser goes, hit the surface is moving, so it's producing its own vibration, the laser will be distorted of a specific way, in a specific way, which is not just the returning journey, but is the returning journey plus the distortion. And that distortion is actually the movement of what you've been hitting. So the engineers were doing it, of course, because they wanted to see how stable walls could be under earthquake conditions. But if you do it on an insect, you would know, for example, if you're looking at the wings of a cricket, you could know how fast they're beating when they're doing their songs. And if you apply that to a root of a plant, then you would do the same. It's like, oh, I can see how fast a root or what kind of frequency the root is emitting. Again, in crickets, in the context of crickets, we know that they are, shaking their little legs and wings because they're singing for mating or whatever. In the case of the plants, we could tell because we had the data showing that there is definitely a frequency being emitted by the roots. But again, we don't know what it means. So it was more opening more questions than answering, but it is often the case in science when you go and look for things that we have no idea. And I was thinking that the interesting thing in this case was the frequencies that the plant's root were emitting were in the same range, more or less, than the frequency that the plant would be listening to, which makes sense because in most animals as well, we can use the frequency that we can also hear.
Well, you mentioned the word perception there. You've mentioned the word listening. You mentioned the word recognize. How on earth could a creature without a sensory apparatus do that? Are we thinking, do you have a working hypothesis? Do you have any evidence that's led you to understand how they could assess sound? I mean, vibration seems like the obvious way. What did you discover?
Well, sound is vibration, which means that if you have a physical body, then potentially any part of your body can be a sounding board, literally in this case. And we know already from animal studies that you don't have to have these specific structures that we call ears, whether they are external like ours or internal like the fish do, to perceive sound, to sense sound. Animals like snake, for example, perceive it through the jaws. And so they need to have the jaws in contact with the ground to perceive the vibrations of other animals or other things that are happening around them. They don't have ears officially, but they do collect all of these sonic information from their environment. As we know, snakes are pretty good responding and being very sharp on their responses to the environment. So plants don't have ears, of course. Otherwise, I think we would have found them by now. But they have a body. And it's possible that the entire body is involved in the perception. And but who knows? We might turn out, in a few years' time, we might decide, now we have located some cells that are particularly good at doing this job. And it wouldn't be surprising because we already know that they are very responsive to gravity, and which is, again, another mechanical way of responding to a force. So sound is also a mechanical wave, and it could be perhaps a similar process. Touch is another, same story, is a mechanical wave. And we know already that plants are very good at responding to touch, and they have specific cell structures that do that. So it's possible that those structures are also employed for multiple purposes, and we haven't just looked at it yet.
Well, we're going to be coming back to this in a moment, listeners, when we get to the big no brain question, which
Yeah.
obviously is right at the center of this debate. Okay, thanks, Monica. So, with that context of the sort of state of the consensus in mind, let's move straight on to the main memory experiments that I want to focus on today, starting with your experiments with the Mimosa plant. Often studied because it responds to stimulus very quickly. So humans can easily see the behavior. In this case, that it closes to protect itself if there's a disturbance, hence its nickname, the sensitive plant. Most plants' response to stimuli is so slow that we can't even perceive the reaction. So it's a really useful plant to study. And obviously, we're going to come back at the end to talk about deep time and this sort of longer time scales of plants and nature later on, Monica. So tell us about this experimental setup. How did you set up the experiment, and what were the results?
I just wanted to add, before we move to the Mimosa, I wanted to add that the story of the bioacoustics was, of course, received very strangely by the academic community or the scientific community. And yet within less than, well, it's been like, what, 10 years or just a bit over 10 years, there are now that I know of at least 3 different labs around the world that specialize on the plant acoustic science. So it's a pretty fast turnover for science. They usually expect the first person to die before they can, discover anything new. So I think the science is moving relatively quickly in this area, just so that, it might take a while to get there, but now that it's here, it's moving relatively fast.
That's unexpected. Brilliant.
Now Mimosa. Mimosa was a good plant to play with. Well, first of all, of course, it's very, it's fun. I think in Italy, actually, they sell it as the plant that you buy for kids because, it's so interactive. For me, it was interesting, of course, because of his behavior. And as you clearly said, it's one of those plants that respond to touch, and he closes the leaf, and he does it right in front of your eyes, and then he reopens the leaves right in front of your eyes. So you can really see the plants behaving in some way. And for me, it was important because the question that I was asking was about learning and memory. And and of course, one thing is to talk about learning and memory of animals, and there are already plenty of barriers even within that space. But to talk about an organism that doesn't even have a brain, and certainly no neural system, even the question was like, why would you ask this question? This is silly. Of course, they can't do this. And Mimosa, for me, represented the closest plant to an animal because of that fast behavior, which is not very common in plants. And so it was a plant that could bridge very quickly, very intuitively, that divide between what an animal can do as behavior and what a plant can do as behavior. In the case of Mimosa, I started with what we consider the simplest or the most basic way of learning. The technical term is habituation. And habituation is something that we all do. If there is a noise in the room that is always the same noise, like the buzzing of the fridge or the air conditioner, you might notice it at the beginning because you just turned on the air conditioning, but then very quickly you kind of switch off that signal and it doesn't bother you. You don't pay attention anymore because through experience you know that signal doesn't do anything. It doesn't mean anything. Of course, you're also well aware that if there is suddenly a fire alarm that goes off, you pay attention immediately and you respond immediately to that because it's telling you that something abnormal has happened. So habituation is the learning mechanism that allows us to learn from experience and then also learn to ignore what is not relevant in that moment. Because through experience, we have learned that, this is nothing to worry about. Because if we had to react to every single noise and input that comes to us, we would burn our nervous system pretty quick and it wouldn't be very feasible. So habituation is a very important system of learning to protect, our physiology and our energy. Now, for the plants, it works exactly the same. And in the case of Mimosa, because of her behavior, I was able to scare the plant. I had to do something that would be, unusual and certainly not part of the plant's everyday experience or even from the past, because it could have been genetically encoded. So I had to find an experience or an input that for the plants was totally meaningless, but sudden. So it's like, I don't know this. What is this? And so in my case, I ended up settling on, okay, I'm going to drop them. And I created this contraption. I promise I didn't hurt any plants, but I created this contraption that allowed me to do like a controlled dropping of these plants from a height of like 15 centimeters, not very much, but enough to basically freak out the plant on the first drop. And like we would do with the animal systems, we would do what we call trains. So they are repeated experiences of that input. So in my case, I repeated the experience of being dropped And of course, I had no idea what a plant would be doing about this. So I totally looked at the literature from the animal field again. And I thought, okay, I'll do X amount of drops. In my case, was 60 drops consecutive. And then we'll see what happened. And because usually that's what it takes for an animal to do to do a response, to have a response to the input. But what happened with Mimosa was that I started dropping them, and after the first 3-4 drops, the plants, of course, the first few drops, and rightly so, close the leaves, because it's like, this is my defense mechanism. I don't know what this thing is. It could be dangerous. And the right response would be like, okay, I'm going to defend. And when the plant closes its leaves, it shows up with like very spiky thorns, which should be, a deterrent. And then if it gets really bad, this plant is also able to play dead. So it droops, and it looks like completely insignificant, completely like, if I was an herbivore, I would probably think like, oh, I don't want to eat this, which is exactly what the signal that the plant is trying to send. So in my case, the plant would close the leaves, which is the right behavior to have in the first instance. But then it takes very little time. So after 3-4 drops, the plant is already reopening the leaves. Why I keep dropping her, and just stays open, which means, at least in the first instance, it would suggest that the plant has worked out already within seconds, basically, that this signal, the drop in this case, although it's pretty annoying and probably quite disturbing, actually doesn't have any bad consequences. Nobody's coming to eat me. I'm not in danger. So the plants needs to preserve energies. And so it's a good idea not to waste your energies in a defense response, like closing your leaves, because when you close your leaves and you're a mimosa, your capacity to photosynthesize is cut off by 40%. So basically, you're only eating half of what you could potentially eat just because you're protecting yourself. But if you're protecting yourself for no reason, then you're actually wasting opportunities for food.
And there was an interesting cohort in your experiment, wasn't there? Because there was this element of hardship. So you did one cohort where they had very, very little light, almost no light. And what was extraordinary was that those mimosa plants learned faster not to close their leaves. And I think there's an important point here about hardship in general in nature, that basically we learn faster when there's more on the line. In this case, the energy coming from the light.
That's right. So, of course, if you have plenty of food, in this case, the light for the mimosa, even if you take your time and you stayed close a little longer, it doesn't really matter, because once you work it out and you open your leaf, you have plenty to eat. But if the light is already a scarce resource and you waste your time by closing for no reason, really, then you're really compromising your survivorship. So that was, as you pointed out, that was a very important element. But then we had to take one step further, which were 2 steps. One was, well, maybe this response is actually not a response, but it's simply the physiology of the plant is so exhausted that it can't do anything. So it's reopening the leaf just because it can't keep them closed. And it's been stressed too much. And so also in animal study, this control is done. And the rules are that you have to present a similar stimulus of the same kind. So the drop is a mechanical stimulus. So I needed to find another mechanical stimulus, but it needs to be different from the original. Otherwise, the plant already knows, or the animal in that case. And so what I decided to do, that to me felt like an adequate stimulus that was similar in kind, mechanical in nature, but not the same, was a shake other than a drop. So I shook them for a little, like a couple of seconds. And again, given that they learn so fast, it had to be a short experience. Otherwise, they would habituate potentially also to that. And what we found is that if you don't give them enough time to habituate, so just literally 1 second, 2 seconds, which is short enough, the plants will simply close the leaves and not reopen them. So that is the adequate response, because if you haven't had the time to learn that the shake in this case is not dangerous, the right response is simply to defend until your experience teaches you otherwise. And so then what you do is like, okay, so that's good, tick. And then what you do, you represent the original stimulus, the drop. So if the plant is really responding, not just reacting, but responding to the original stimulus, as soon as you represent it, it should be like, oh yeah, I already know this, and I don't need to close because I know that is nothing. And in fact, that's exactly what we found, that the plants didn't even bother closing anymore, but not because they were exhausted, that was proven by the control of the shaking, but because they realized, they learned that it's like, well, this is annoying, but it doesn't do anything. So I can just keep my leaves open and keep feeding on the light. And the interesting part of that second part was that then I was curious to see, well, okay, clearly they've learned. They know what we're doing. They know what this drop is, or they know that they can ignore it. But how long would they remember this information? And so I was very naive, or very arrogant, I should say. And I thought, I reckon that within 3 hours, 3 days, 6 days, they won't know. So I did all this trial. And every time I was proven very wrong. And the plants were very like remembering very clearly. So they would always like respond very proficiently to the test. And so I kept extending the amount of time that I had to leave them alone before returning and presenting my stimulus of the drop. And so I got to 28 days and the plant still remembered. And then I ran out of time and I was like, okay, you won. And so the plants were having basically a long-term memory, because when 28 days for a plant is a long time, if we compare that time with an animal like a bee. And but at the same time, probably for a plant that lives a life, as you mentioned before, in a very different time scale with very different time ranges, 28 days is probably like nothing.
It certainly begs more research, doesn't it? And maybe these very strong results over time could justify longer term funding, and also potentially similar experiments with older plants. So maybe plants that live for longer might have even longer memories.
There were
Fantastic.
studies done with the Mimosa subsequent to this study. There have been a few studies done with Mimosa itself outside in the field, which is where it should be done. And showing similar processes going on in the field as well. So that work has been kind of validated, confirmed outside in the field as well.
So, after the success of the Mimosa experiment in demonstrating the plant's memory and the adaptive behavior based on that memory, which is an important point, you understandably wanted to take it a bit further and see if plants could also demonstrate associative memories. So, similar here to the famous Pavlovian dog experiments, where an arbitrary bell sound eventually stimulates saliva in the dog's mouth because the bell has become associated with the imminent food. In that sense, the bell had become meaningful to the dog. So if successful, your plant version of this experiment would have massive implications for the plant intelligence field, because it would demonstrate a meaning-making ability in the plant. Now tell us, how did you set up this experiment with peas to test this higher order type of memory and function, and what were the results?
Mm-hmm. So compared to the habituation, that is considered basic form of learning, and habituation is being found everywhere where we have looked. The associative learning is a little bit of a higher order, because in habituation you have to basically work out what one stimulus means and then respond to that. While in the associative learning, as you mentioned, there are two. There is the bell, in this case with the dog, that usually doesn't have, or it must have no meaning to start with. And then there is the thing that you want, which in this case with the dog was dinner. So according to this principle, I designed the same experiment, but with a pea plant. And I had to put of course, I had the same problems. Like, okay, with the dog, you can see that the dog is salivating, and that is the behavior that you can measure. Again, what am I going to measure with a plant? And I didn't want to use Mimosa because I wanted to move towards a plant that was more your average plant, if we can say that. There are no average plants, but like a plant that moves more or less at the time of most plants. Mimosa is way too fast and too special for that. And I wanted to make sure that it would be like, yeah, this is not because of Mimosa, it's because all plants potentially can do this. And then I settled for peas because they're also climbers, and especially when they're little, they grow fast and they direct themselves towards structures where they can then climb over. And we have all seen this. That's why when we grow peas, we put like trellings and things where they can, attach themselves. So it's okay, let's try with peas. And I created these. Imagine the letter Y, and I created a maze with this form where at the base of the Y, you have the P. And of course, it's got a little space to grow up vertically. That is what they do normally. And then they have to choose which way they are going to go. And I wanted to see if that choice could be informed by the experiences that I was providing with two different cues. Like for the dog, instead of the bell, I used a little fan, which is the fan that we use, we find in our little laptops. And of course, like the bell, the fan didn't elicit any behavior, anything, any change of anything in the plant, which was good. And then, of course, like the signal or the input that the plants really wanted, like for the dog, needed to be dinner. And for a plant, dinner would be light. And for baby plants like these peas, the blue light would be particularly appealing. So just like Pavlov did with this dog, I presented the fan first, no meaning, and then followed by the light. And of course, plants being very smart, we know that they will habituate. And so to avoid that, they would just simply habituate to the fact that these signals were always coming from one side of this potential maze. I had to keep moving them around in random places, in random ways, maybe twice this side, and then I move you to the other side, and then again back and forth. And I did that for 3 days. But the constant was the fan is always arriving first, and then it's followed by dinner, the light. And at the end of the 3 days, I would simply have one day of test, which was the day in which the fan comes on, but it's never followed by the light. And at that point, it was the point where the Y shape splits. So you need to, as a P, you need to decide which way you're going to go. And if you, during those 3 days of growth and training, understood that the fan always comes before the light, so it's predicting the arrival of the light, and that would be associative learning, then you would go towards the fan because it's your predictor. It's telling you where the light is going to be, even if the light is not there yet. And that's exactly what the plants do. The majority of them grow towards the side of this Y, also this maze, where the fan is playing or moving, even if there is no light for them to detect yet, because that was the test. And that was really big because I remember very clearly that even while I was doing the piloting of this test and this experiment for 2 weeks, I thought it wasn't working. And I was really convinced as we tried and maybe plants can't do it. And then I realized that I was making a big mistake in the way in which I was looking at what the plants were doing. And then, of course, many months of training and testing followed. And we also we tested, we did the same experiment twice. And on the second lot, what we presented was the fan and the light always coming in the same temporal pairing. So the fan always comes before the light, but this time they're not spatially paired. So they're not coming from the same direction. So wherever the fan is, the light will come from the opposite side. And so again, randomly move them around, but always temporally paired, spatially not paired. And so in this case, while in the first experiment, what the fan meaning, if the plant is understanding or allocating meaning to the fan, would be follow me, I tell you where the light is coming from. In the second experiment, what the fan acquired meaning would be is go away from me, because the light is always going to come from the other way. and they do as equally well. So showing, again, not just associative learning, which is just, it's amazing, but also that this capacity is not just paired in time, but also it's possible to pair it in time and space, and also not.
And how long did the memory last in this case?
This this experiment was like it took all my blood. So I did not do the follow-up experiment, which is of course is the obvious question. We had lots of questions in my notes. For example, if these plants have learned this now, would the offspring have to learn again, or would there be an epigenetic trace that would say like, oh yeah, when you see a fan, don't worry, the light always follows, and you just have to learn like very briefly, and so maybe the timing of learning is shortened, and I don't know.
There's a
Yeah,
million
exactly.
questions, and
So
we're not going to have time to get through them all today. But the first big
yeah.
one for me is what for you, and I guess what for the field as well. Let's sort of not talk yet about the skeptical reception of these results, but what for you are the implications scientifically? Let's say if we were talking to a bunch of mainstream plant scientists, what does this data mean for the nature of plants?
Hmm. Well, it opens up many questions, not just for plants, and that's the thing I think that is the most powerful. Is like, okay, it's amazing for the plant field for plants to do these things, and maybe who knows how many more that we haven't even tried or tested yet. But it's important for the entire biological field, because it means that some of the tenets that we have as this is the truth about things operating in a particular way with particular structures. Of course, I'm talking about the brain and the nervous system, might not be as a solid truth as we thought of them to be. Because, of course, the plants don't have a nervous system, don't have brains, they're not neural systems, and yet they are able to do and perform the same tasks. So the question would be like, then obviously, this structure, the brain and the nervous system, for how amazing they are and how useful they are in those systems that they have them, they're not the end of the story. So if you don't have them, doesn't mean anything. It just means that you can do the same things, but resolving the problem in a different way. And I think that this, it's important because it helps us to revise some of the issues that we still have within the animal field, where we evaluate the capacity of animals, for example, to feel pain in fish, because it's a field that I know. It's still questioned, there is so much debate, and it's like, we shouldn't even talk about this anymore. And just because it doesn't have the part of the brain that should have been developed enough, and it's like, but what if that is not the way in which a fish does things? The same way as, well, the plant is doing it, but is doing it in a very plant way. And so I think it would encourage us to reevaluate our assumptions about certain things, not just for plants, but across the board. And of course, for me as well, is like, is also, it could be also inspiring us in that process of reevaluating our assumption, reevaluating the assumption about the human as well, and how we might can do things differently. That there is not just one way of finding solutions to problems. And I'm talking about both, of course, at the physical, physiological, biological level, but also as a societal, cultural level, because at the end, these systems are embedded in other animals, in plants, and all other organisms within a context. And that's why I'm an ecologist. We always look at the relationships, and you can't take one element, extract it from its context, and say this is how it works, because the context will make it what it is. So,
I mean, a massive question for me here is where are the memories themselves encoded in the plant, given the lack of a brain or a nervous system? I mean, does the plant have an equivalent, a sort of plant equivalent of a nervous system? does it bring us towards a kind of extended mind, distributed memory hypothesis of nature? Where have you landed on this? I guess you've had quite a few years to think about it.
Yeah. Well, I often think about the nervous system at its most functional, basic level. So, what does a nervous system really do? And ultimately, is an amazing system to transport electrical signals, electrochemical signals. And so if we stop being so focused on calling it a particular way, like this is the neural system, and we just focus on the function of a system of cells that are specialized to do a job and is transferring really fast neurochemical, electrochemical signals, then we would say that all life does that. And in fact, the famous life, the spark of life, because at the end we are all very electrical and electrochemical. And plants in specific are masters at all these electrochemistry. And there is a lot of research done on that, and it's not even new. It's been done for a long time. So from that perspective, I would like to say that there is not much difference. Of course, each organism has developed, evolved through with solutions that are very specific, and that's the amazingness. But that specificity doesn't make them special or better than. And I think that this is maybe the false step that our modern science has taken, and we have also for other reasons, cultural, societal, political, we have put the brain and the nervous system at the pinnacle of this functionality because we have one, and it makes us special. If the brain and the nervous system are special, then we have one, and it makes us special. And it would be very disappointing if we had to accept that plants are as good or even better at doing the job of electrochemistry, and probably they are. And so, yeah, I think that it opens up again questions of who are we really in the context of the ecologies that we inhabit as a species.
Well, that's definitely where we're going to go with this conversation. And we could go on for another half an hour just on this sort of field phenomena questions about sort of electric signals and where the memory is encoded. But I think it's such an open question rather than navel gazing. I want to get on to the rest of your work, Monica, but it is all in Monica's book, which we're going to talk about as well. Okay, so now we've covered the sort of strict science of this matter, as hard as it is for the consensus to sort of stomach the massive implications. We have to introduce the genuinely mind-blowing information that you speak about so personally and engagingly in your really highly recommended book, Thus Spoke the Plant. In this book, you explain the uncomfortable truth for many scientists that you learned to communicate with plants. Yep, I said you learned to communicate with plants using indigenous modalities that have been used for thousands of years to gather information and knowledge directly from the natural world. Perhaps most bizarrely of all from a scientific perspective, that the plant told you where your experiment was failing and gave you the correct setup, which eventually led to your positive results. Now, tell us the extraordinary story of how you were called into plant studies, how you first learned to communicate with plants, and of course, the hilarious story of how the plant told you how to fix your experiment, because it's a diamond.
Yeah, it's quite embarrassing, I think, for a scientist, right?
I don't think so.
It's
I
like,
think
I
humbling.
tried.
I think it's
Yeah, that's
humbling.
right. I got plenty of humbling experiences through this. Well, as I mentioned before, I was a marine scientist, and I was in the field. And at one point, I had a very profound and life-changing, literally, experience with my fish because I was in the field doing an experiment that lasted like 3 or 4 months, and I was working with these wild animals. So every day I would go, and I was looking at maternal effects, so the role of moms, and the stress on moms, on the progenies, and how that would impact. And so I would go and check my mom and dad's every day. And some of these fish, again, wild animals, would come and check me out. And then after several days of seeing each other every day, and then weeks and months, these fish would approach me. Not all of them, of course, they have different personalities, each one their own. And they would approach me. They would even come in my hand, and I could even close my hand around them, and they'd be like, "Oh, this is just Monica." And then on the last day of the experiment, I had to go and collect them all because my science at the time, like much of the animal science, requires the sacrifice of the animal for the sake of data collected, from different organs for, I don't know, fats analysis or stress hormones analysis in my case for this experiment. So, but because I spent so much time with them every day, for weeks, for months, I remember very clearly going in the water that morning thinking, I just want to go with nothing except myself, and I want to go and say goodbye. And that morning, nobody came out of the reef to greet me. Actually, everyone was hiding within the reef, and I could see them through the little holes, like looking at me. And it was like I had this horrible, cold feeling of like, oh God, they know. They know what my intentions are, and they know that Monica today is not the same Monica that we saw for the last 3-4 months. And so I remember going back in the afternoon, because often when we are shocked into these experiences, we just revert into the thing that we know. Or at least that's what I did. And so in the afternoon, I went back with my nets and everything, and I still collected them all. And they fighted for their life. I fighted for my data. And yeah, it was the last time, though, that I could do that kind of work in that way. And so then that kickstarted a whole revision for me of like me as a scientist, me as my science practice. How are you doing this science? Why are you doing it the way in which you're doing it? Okay, you were trained this way, but shouldn't you question how this training maybe is not longer appropriate, or maybe it was never appropriate? So all of those ethical questions, moral questions. And so I had a bit of a crisis because it's like, oh my God, I can't be a scientist anymore. And I tried to do some experiments without taking any bodies. And it was very clear very quickly that there wasn't much space. I would have run out of opportunities in how to do my experiments very quickly. And at that time, it just happened that we moved from one part of Australia to another part of Australia. And by moving house, I had the opportunity to start a new little veggie garden. And as I planted my, basil plant and tomatoes and chili plants, and I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. I can't be a scientist like this anymore. And then one day, while I was in my garden, was the plant themselves. They were like, you can work with us. And I was like, what? And it's like, yeah, you can work with us. You can take a leaf and we don't die. You can take your samples if you need to and nothing happens. And I was like, first of all, like, are you talking to me? And second was, wait a second, I don't know anything about plants. And they were like, don't worry, we'll just teach you. And so for as mad as this sound, basically that was the beginning of a totally different scientist. And in fact, my very first experiments were with basil and chili plants because they were in my garden and they were like, well, we could do this. And then of course, if you fast forward over the years, as you mentioned already, I got humbled many times. And the best one was when that was in regards to the experiment with the Pavlovian pea, because a few years before I actually ran the experiment, immediately after Mimosa, I was like, oh my God, we need to test for Pavlovian learning now. And I had decided that I was going to do this experiment with sunflower seedlings, because of course they are another plant that gives us a very clear behavioral response to light in particular that you can measure or you can see. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do sunflower seedlings, and I'm going to use light, of course. And I thought I had the right setup. I had a camera that could like watch in time lapse and all of that. And I was very proud of myself, but it wasn't working. And I tried several times and I know it's not working. oh, well, plants cannot do this. And I completely forgot about it. I just simply said, okay, that was it. They can do habituation, which is basic learning, so okay. But, Pavlovian learning is already too difficult for plants. And then, a couple of years passed and I found myself totally unrelated. I found myself in the Amazon, where I was involved in this process, which is called Dieta, which is an indigenous practice of, getting in connection and communication with plants. And so I was interested in exploring. I had already done one before and it was like mind blowing. So I thought, I'm going to go again. I want to learn more about plants in this way. But I wasn't thinking about my experiments. I was simply like doing my own little exploration as a human. And then one day while I'm there doing my thing, and in this case, I want to clarify, just in case people think that I was taking drugs. There was no ayahuasca or any psychedelic plant involved. I was working with this big tree, and you just drink like a tea every other day or whenever the curandero, the shaman, as we call them, would decide, and that's it. And he was giving me lots of dreams, but that was it. And during the day, I was very myself, pretty much, and I was keeping a diary. I always do when I do these things because I never know what is coming up and what is important, what is not. And then one day I found myself drawing on this diary on the page, and I was drawing like these letter Y shaped things, and then it was like, oh, it needs to be this big, this tall, and I just, as I looked, I was like, oh my God, but this is an experiment. And of course, that became a very famous experiment now, which is the Pavlovian P. But the funny part, that is the one that you were hinting at, that at the very end of all the instructions, so I got given how many times, how big the pipe need to be, and do this and do that. It was like, oh, and by the way, not sunflowers. You need to use peas. And I was like, what? So of course, I returned to Australia, set up my lab according to the instructions that I had received. And of course, I used peas. And the rest of the story we know.
So many listeners, as you mentioned, will be thinking of plant medicine psychedelic traditions here,
That's right.
where people do receive highly transformational information from the ayahuasca plant brew. For example, there are many of these
Yeah.
psychedelic shamanic brews, whilst in their altered states. But you, although you have experienced that interface with the plant, you have tended to favor the South American Dieta approach that you just mentioned. And this sort of prepares you, it slows you down from your human speed through the sort of classic yogic kind of ascetic style of removal of most foods, removal of human interaction, removal of stimulants for about a week beforehand. Tell us just a little bit about this method. We haven't got much time, but I just want to hear basically what it is, and also describe what it feels like to be in community with the plants, because I imagine they don't speak in words.
No, definitely there is no like a booming voice that tells you, and you're there in your little yoga position, sitting there waiting. No, it's none of that. Well, the Dieta process can be diverse. It depends on the plant. It depends on the person, the curandero or curandera that is supporting the process. And but ultimately is about, as you mentioned perfectly, is like it's about removing all the other distractions so that you can be so bored because you're just with yourself and there is nothing to do except being there, that you really slow down. And after a while, also your mind stop bothering with like the usual. But what happened in there? Oh, what about this? Oh, I need to do that, and it just quiets itself down. And like many other practices in that space, then other things can be heard and emerge. The plants, in my experience, for the Dieta speaks primarily through dreams. So you will receive very different dreams, and you, part of the process of the Dieta is to be aware of your dreams, because a lot of the conversation with the plants will come through that. But as I also shared before, sometimes during the day you will be, in my case I was writing my diary, and because I keep the diary all the time, many times I had things that feels like thoughts that don't belong to you. And some of the information, I know that they're not mine, because often the plants have given me information about the medical use, and I'm not a medical doctor, so there is no way I would know. Often I don't even know what the plant is. So I wouldn't like, oh yeah, I already have this information. And in fact, I really like it that way. That's the scientist in me, is like, I'm going to go blind so that whatever information comes in, then I can fact check it afterwards. And so many times I have dieted plants that I didn't even know what the Latin name was. I only had the common name. And then I had to do the work after, like working out what plant that is, and then check if there is any scientific literature already published on the medical properties, for example, of that particular plant. And sometimes I found nothing. And many times I found like, oh my God, that's exactly what the plant told me, which is, for us seems so amazing and so like, whoa. But in a indigenous context, especially in the Peruvian context, where this practice has been there for a long time, that's how they do it. So
And do
it's
they
like,
take questions? Do they have, is it a practice designed to that you bring a particular question to that plant?
if you're good at it, yeah. I know the curanderos often, enter in those spaces with a very specific question. Maybe, for example, they need to heal someone and they don't really know what's going on. So they enter in those spaces and in those processes to like, okay, I don't know, as a human, I don't know what is going on and I don't know what to do, but I need information. I need some help here. And of course, they're very proud of the Dieta work that they've done over the years, because the more Dieta, so the more plants have allied themselves with, the more information are, like you got many books, the more information you have available when you ask. And so, yeah, they're basically doctors with their books in the sky, or in the earth, I should say. And they are accessible with a particular practice. And I think that when they're very good, they don't need to do a dieta. They just need to connect as they do, I don't know. And basically simply ask, is like, okay, for this person with this condition, what is required? And the right plant will whisper to them, literally. So
And what about psychedelics? I mean, what communications have you had with those plants? There does seem to be a general theme coming through the practitioners of the indigenous ayahuasca lineage, for example, that the plants are really worried about the way we're causing biosphere collapse. What's your experience of these plant medicine messages, and how do they differ from the voice and themes you heard from other plants through the Dieta practice?
mhm. Well, the dieta practice can be done with or without the support of these other plant medicines. So sometimes the ayahuasca, for example, arrives as part of the dieta, and other times doesn't. The experiment with the Pavlovian pea, during that dieta, for example, there was no ayahuasca involved. Other dieta that I've done, I had to drink ayahuasca every other day. So it depends on the plant, it depends on what's happening, it depends on the curandero or curandera as well, and their style. So I don't see them as separate processes. It's just that each one of them, like with everything, each one of them has its role. And in the context of the dieta, for me, the ayahuasca has this clarifying role. So when things are happening with the main plants that you're working with, sometimes the arrival of the ayahuasca can help amplifying things, and so you can see them clearer or you can understand them better. But to your question directly of like the current situation, that's my last data. That was my question. Okay, what can I do for this mess? And I was given lots of homework, some of which I'm trying to do, some of which I've started doing. And amongst the other things, I was given this list of chapters. And I was like, what is this? And it's like, yeah, these are the chapters for your next book. And I was like, I'm not writing a book. I mean, like the fire, the jungle is on fire, the world is on fire, and I'm asking you, what can I do to serve this moment? And you're telling me, amongst other things, oh, you need to write a book. And so, but I don't, yeah, I don't dare say no to these guys. So, yeah, so now that I go back to Australia, that's what I will be doing, starting writing my new book.
Mm. So on the back of all of this, you've received an expectable pushback from the mainstream plant science field, alongside glorious support from the general public, from Indigenous communities, from the plant medicine community, and from ecosystem activists around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this pushback is largely due to this neural theory of consciousness consensus in science that brains and nervous systems are crucial for adaptive learning, for memory, for communication, even for a subjective experience. And yet you've seized on this pushback to point out that it is this very reductionist, separatist understanding of nature that's led us to the brink of ecosystem collapse. So on the contrary, you're promoting a wider vision of our part in the extended, interconnected intelligence of nature. You claim that we urgently need to extend our worldview to include our interconnectedness with the biosphere and non-separation from the land, a reciprocity with nature, a connection beyond death, actually, to the collective adaptive intelligence of our ancestors, as far back even as our ancestors of bacteria and viruses and microorganisms, which are still a big part of our DNA, listeners, remember. So tell us a bit about what you think's missing in reductionist science on this matter, and how science can clearly grow to include this kind of worldview without the method losing any of its rigorous qualities and this sort of vision of yours of a bioconsciousness that could accompany that rebirth of science, if you like.
Yeah, well, that's part of the work that I was given from my last Dieta. So it's for me, it's very clear that we have many bodies of knowledge and ways of knowledge, and Western science is a beautiful method. It's got its limit, like all methods, and it's also got its beauty. Like it can do a lot of things. You know, I mean, just looking at this, we are talking right now because of Western science and its creative abilities. But we also know that it can be very destructive, and it has a history of being the right hand of colonialism. And so that's his darker side, and we should acknowledge that too. And on the other side, amongst many other ways, there is clearly an indigenous science, which Western science seems to snob because it doesn't understand it, and it doesn't even consider it a science, and it doesn't acknowledge that it's actually the way from which modern science has arisen. Because even like within a Western context, as a European, you know, before science as we know it, there were a lot of experimenter, and many of them were probably doing similar practices and similar approaches as our indigenous people are still doing now. But we seem to have distanced ourselves from that ancestry. And I think that in that sense, we really need to, especially in the West, we really need to reacquaint ourselves with our ancestry. And we will find that we're not that far off from what indigenous people around the world are still holding as a body of knowledge. And so I think for me, and this is what the work that I'm doing at the moment is precisely this, to invite the dialogue and also the work together of these two sciences, which I see are just science, so that they can work together, not so that they are like 1+1, but they really transcend their own limitation and also their own goodness to become something else that is just going to be science. And hopefully a science that is go a little bit more heart, a little bit more care for this place, and so that it does what is required, and it does also say no to those things that we know just because we can. It doesn't mean that we have to. We should do, and I don't know if we're gonna succeed as a species. But certainly, I've decided that whatever time we have, this is what I'm going to try and do. And I have officially left academia last year, a year exactly now. And I have no idea precisely how I'm going to I'm gonna move, and now I'm gonna become. The scientist remains because that's me. What kind of scientist? I mean, I need to be myself the experiment. And this is certainly I learned through my own science and in the science with the plants. So this experiment of merging these two perspectives, scientific perspective, I feel very much like it needs to start here. It needs to be embodied in my own way of practicing science. And I don't think there was enough space in academia for me, because I would still remain within one space. And so last year I decided to, okay, so let's remove ourselves from one box. Let's stay with no box and see if we can create a totally new box that has both. And so that's the job at hand. And I have no idea. We will have to chat again and see if I survived or not. But that's certainly the vision.
Well, it's a lofty vision. And I think the way you marry these, potentially, we could consider them completely separate things, but actually, the way you marry them together, it all seems very, very logical and together. And I wish you all the very, very best moving forward with that. Now, we have run out of time, Monica, so I didn't get to talk about collective system cognition. I wanted to get your opinion. I know you've been in conversation with Evan Thompson, with Marcelo Gleiser, both who are going to be on the show. Marcelo Gleiser in the last episode, and Evan Thompson I'm going to be speaking to very shortly. So just, we must find another opportunity, come back and speak. I think one of the questions I had was also about deep time. I know you've been thinking a lot about this idea that time and plants, plants and ecosystems themselves and planets, and they're just working with such a totally different time scale that in itself would change the way we see these creatures as being intelligent. Just the very fact that they've lasted so long, the fact that they've gathered so much knowledge, if you like, in their ancestry, those kind of ways of looking at problems could just totally switch everything. So I definitely, yes, once your new book comes out, Monica, let's talk again. Unsurprisingly, given all of these results and implications combined with this message about this crucial time for ecosystem survival, it has led you to being invited to all sorts of panels and discussions, including on the future of science, which we just discussed, but also on the future of humanity. All of these talks, listeners, and panels are fascinating. So do just get online, check out Monica's visionary speaking engagements. She has this delightful way of just allowing in multidisciplinary thinking, whether it's poetry or whether it's just a true sort of honorary respect for the sort of inherent intelligence in nature. Highly recommend some of those chats. So just to close, Monica, can you give us, listeners, you must get Thus Spoke the Plant. It is such a lovely book. Everybody adores it because it's so personal. It really shows the internal process of, I think, shock as well, when a scientist is really, all of their instincts and intuitions are put on the line. And Monica just tells this so beautifully in this book. You'll absolutely love it. So do go out and buy that. But can you give us any inkling of these chapters you've been given, or is it just too secret? I know you're now basically the ambassador for the plant world. Is there anything you can give away, or do we just have to wait?
It's squirrel business. So I think we'll have to wait, but not because I don't want to share. It's because it's still working inside me. But I think what I'm being asked to try and explore is basically this new science, which is not going to be, I don't think it's going to be anything that we have seen yet. And therefore, I don't know exactly how it's going to look like. And I have a feeling that this book is going to take me a while, because some of the experiences that I'm exploring, some of the things that I'm doing right now are already an embodiment of this potential new science. But until I have gone through, I don't know if I can explain them. And so, but we'll see. Maybe I'm totally wrong, and in 6 months it's done. Who knows? My agent would be very happy if that was the case, but I don't think so. So yeah, unfortunately, I am also waiting to see. So we'll have to catch up again.
Well, we love mystery and we love the unknown. It stimulates our curiosities. So, on that note, on behalf of the listeners, Monica Gagliano, thank you so much for your time and wishing you all the very best on your journey.
Thank you so much, Freddie, and everyone that listened. Thank you.